everyone. Okay, perfect. So the recording has started. So hi, everyone. Welcome back. We are starting the second half of the day with Dr. Richard PREUSS, an associate professor in the School of Physical and Occupational Therapy at McGill University, and associate director for the physical therapy program. He is also chair of the PT program, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Anti-Racism in Learning committee, and is the school representative on the widening participation committee for the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. Mr. PREUSS is going to introduce us to some of the pitfalls and positive aspects of equity, diversity, and inclusion. His intro goes as, over the past several years, the university has been overwhelmed by messages promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion. Ironically, many of these messages have been more divisive than inclusive. This talk will argue that critical theory is a valid philosophy, but only when combined with critical thinking. For EDI initiative to live up to their name, they must avoid fallacious argumentation, emotive language, motivated reasoning, and confirmation bias, negative attribution bias, and zero-sum thinking. Rather, they should clearly differentiate justice from revenge and ensure that fundamental human rights are upheld. They should encourage diversity of thought, multiculturalism, and blind meritocracy, while still making room for restorative justice. University EDI programs must recognize that outcomes are affected by both individual and societal factors and work to strengthen both. Richard PREUSS.
So thank you very much for the introduction. I just want to make sure that everyone can see my screen okay. Are we seeing my the slides?
Yeah, we can see it, Richard. Thanks.
Oh, terrific. So I will thank, first of all, the organizers of the conference for inviting me to speak. I will say I don't feel like I'm actually an expert on issues related to EDI. You mentioned in the introduction that I'm involved in several committees that are EDI related at McGill and within our program, but largely that was because I was sort of thrust into these positions as we started to recognize this need to address the call for addressing EDI issues within our program. So I would say about 3 years ago is when I started to get involved in this. And the first thing that I did was essentially just try to inform myself about what equity, diversity, and inclusion meant. And I will admit that for the first little while, I had a lot of trouble getting a straight answer from anyone, particularly with respect to what equity meant. It seemed that people were using the term equity just as a synonym for fairness. And of course, fairness can be very subjective depending on the point of view. So I decided as an academic to try to dive into the literature a little bit and went outside my comfort zone and started looking into the social sciences literature. And here, let me just make sure I can advance this, good. I stumbled upon the concept of equity theory, and in particular found an article published way back in 1980 that I found very, very useful from the standpoint of understanding equity theory. And there, equity was defined as a contributions rule within the more general concept of distributive fairness or distributive justice. And that definition actually came from an even earlier article published in 1963 by Adams that talked specifically about inequity in the workplace. And there, the idea of inequity was when people thought that they were making a larger contribution relative to the rewards that they were receiving within that institution. So essentially, their equity was defined as existing when people perceive the ratio between the contributions that they make and the rewards that they receive to be the same for everyone. So essentially, the idea of equal work for equal pay, which is essentially a meritocratic system. But I was constantly seeing things like this cartoon trying to just simply contrast equity as being different from equality. But if you look at that cartoon, there's absolutely nothing in there to suggest that this has anything to do with the contributions that the people have made. And simply, it's a distribution based on needs. And this article by Leventhal really did get into this, looking at different approaches to distributive justice and distributive fairness, and essentially argued that depending on the context, there may be different ways in which resources can be allocated that would be considered to be fair or just. And I would suggest that within a university setting, where we're looking at who is admitted to a program with limited enrollment, how grant money is distributed, we really should be looking at that meritocratic approach to distribution. So an equitable approach based on the definition of equity used in equity theory. If we wanted to look at something like the healthcare system, though, there it would make sense to use more of a needs-based distribution. People should receive the treatment that they need. People who don't need the treatment shouldn't receive it. If we wanted to look at a system where equality or equal distribution would make sense, you could look at something as simple as cutting a birthday cake at a child's birthday party, if you want to make sure that everybody is getting the same sized slice of cake. But then there were other things that needed to be considered as well. There may be certain commitments that had been made that need to be adhered to. There may be legal requirements in terms of how resources can be allocated. Issues of ownership come up, right? We can't just start reallocating things that people own. But where the problem really arises, I think, is when we look at the last two items on that list, and when people are making arguments for distributive fairness based on things like status and self-interest. And I think this is, to some degree, where a lot of the issues around EDI have become problematic, in that there are advocates or activist groups essentially pushing for fairness, or what they perceive to be fairness, based to some degree on self-interest rather than on merit. So I would suggest that if we are going to define equity within a university institution, that we should be defining it as the creation and implementation of policies that are free from bias and favoritism, and that they ensure the opportunities, benefits, and outcomes experienced by everyone are commensurate with their work, contributions, and merit. The next thing that I did then, of course, was look into what diversity means. And I thought that was going to be very easy. Diversity essentially just means that we have people representing different demographic groups. But I believe that when we're looking at diversity in the context of ideology, it has more become about diversity ideologies. Individuals' beliefs regarding the importance of demographic differences and how we should be navigating them. And there, we look at some of the demographic differences that receive a lot of attention. So age, skin color, ethnic origin, gender identity. But we seem to be discounting other demographic differences like political conviction or viewpoint diversity. And if we want to look at the type of diversity that actually benefits higher education institutions, actually benefits universities and colleges, I would argue that things like political diversity and viewpoint diversity are actually more important than superficial features like skin color. So if we are going to define diversity, I think that we should be looking at diversity as referring to the presence and representation of individuals demonstrating a variety of dimensions, qualities, and characteristics, including but not limited to things like race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, but making sure that we are also including things like religious and ethical values systems, political beliefs, experiences, and viewpoints, things that actually contribute to the depth of discussion at universities. And then the last question, of course, is what is inclusion? And this one I thought was going to be even simpler than diversity, because essentially, if we have a diverse group of individuals, we simply need to make sure that they are included in the system. But of course, it's not enough to simply include someone. That person actually has to feel like they belong there. So I started looking into the concept of psychological belonging. And there I really got into the weeds of things that I hadn't been prepared to look at. In fact, I found a review article that just published 30 plus different definitions of psychological belonging that they found in the literature. But the one that really spoke to me the most was this: the experience of personal involvement in a system or environment, so the persons feel themselves to be an integral part of that system or environment. And there are really two things that need to be present. The people need to feel valued, needed, and accepted within the environment, and they need to feel that their characteristics articulate with or complement the system or environment. And that last point, I think, is really important because it doesn't say that everyone has to have the same values, that everyone has to have the same beliefs. It simply says that to feel like you belong, you have to believe that your values and beliefs and viewpoints articulate with or complement the system. And again, that comes down to the idea of diversity. If we're going to have diverse viewpoints, then we need to make sure that those viewpoints contribute to and complement the depth and breadth of discussion that is going to be had at the university environment, and that we're not looking at inclusion based simply on diversity ideologies, where we want to include people based on certain characteristics, but exclude them based on other characteristics. So what I would suggest from the standpoint of inclusion is that we look at a definition where inclusion refers to the presence of a culture that strives to embrace and value diversity in all its forms, not just in some domains. So that was essentially the beginning of my journey into this, this area of EDI. And as I started to explore a little bit more, I started to speak to more people, read more about it, listen to podcasts related to it. I started to notice some repetitive issues in terms of the way that people were arguing for EDI, things that I think make it very easy to attack those viewpoints because they have certain logical flaws to them, and issues that essentially make it easy to discount some of the arguments in favor of EDI initiatives. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking largely about some of these pitfalls. Within there, I'll be throwing in some of the positives that were said to be included as well. But mostly I want to focus on some of the mistakes that I think people may be making when arguing for EDI initiatives. And I think that by not making these mistakes, it will actually both make the EDI initiatives more valuable and more inclusive. So the first one is the idea of mistaking beliefs for knowledge. And this is particularly illustrated by something that I've heard many people say now, that we need to respect different ways of knowing. And that had always struck me as a little bit odd. And I will admit I am not an expert in epistemology, but I do understand that this is something that has been studied for centuries, if not millennia, what it means to know something. So when people start throwing out the idea of different ways of knowing, I would like to have an explanation of what that means. And most people who have said this to me or in my presence haven't been able to tell me what that means. So what I want to do is just provide a very brief definition of what my understanding would be in terms of the difference between belief and knowledge. So I would define a belief as a strong sensation of confidence that something is true. The problem is that that type of a belief can be partially or completely independent of reason or empirical observation. And often that type of belief is adopted just because of a sudden epiphany or through some form of motivated reasoning. Contrast that with knowledge. And here I mean knowledge of fact or an understanding of truth. So here knowledge really being an understanding of and belief in facts or truth and truth. And that is much, much harder to achieve, right? It is easy to form a belief about something, but gaining a really in-depth understanding of something is very, very difficult to do. And it can really only be approximated through the use of empiricism, so repeated observation, essentially summed up in the scientific method, where you have to control for biases, you have to make sure that those observations aren't being skewed by the way that you're looking at them, etc. And then, of course, you also need to include rationalism as well. You need to include a reasonable interpretation of what is being observed. You need to make sure that your interpretation doesn't have biases, that it doesn't make certain mistakes in terms of how you are interpreting that. And of course, that requires an extensive amount of study. You can't simply come to knowledge of fact through a very, very quick search of a certain topic. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is that I have noticed there is a big difference in terms of how EDI is approached by activists and how EDI really should be approached in academia. And I'm going to simplify things a little bit here, but I would suggest that an activist is someone who believes that they know the truth and feels compelled to impose that belief on others. whereas an academic is someone who must recognize that their beliefs are potentially flawed or even wrong, and is willing to adjust those beliefs based on new evidence and rational arguments. And here I want to present some of the things that I have seen in terms of how many people advocating for EDI in the university are presenting arguments in a way that I think are flawed. And I'll give some examples that I think most people will be familiar with. And I'll start this by essentially addressing the idea of critical theory. Now, I think that critical theory, the way that I understand it at least, is a very, very valuable tool. The problem is that it cannot be applied without critical thinking. So I want to start this section with a quote from an article published in 2010 titled "Critical Theory." "When a philosophy is embraced without question and fails to problematize wider society, it has become an ideology in need of critique." And essentially what this is saying is that the basis of critical theory is that we need to be open to questioning our biases. We need to be open to challenging our assumptions. And we need to make sure that we are promoting critical thinking about our beliefs. The difficulty there, though, is that in order to properly question a bias or challenge an assumption, we have to come up with a well-reasoned argument why that assumption might be wrong, or why what you are referring to is actually a bias. It needs to be sensitive to context. We can't necessarily apply the same approaches for everything. And most importantly, we need to make sure that beliefs are self-correcting whenever we are presented with new evidence. So some of the issues that have essentially come up here really mean that, these two things sometimes get used in isolation. But if we use critical theory and critical thinking together, I think they can be viewed as tools to actually prevent the rise and entrenchment of problematic and irrational ideologies. So I'll give a few examples of things that I would suggest are mistakes that are being made in arguments for EDI and that really need to be corrected in order to provide a good argument in favor of many of the things that are being advocated for. The first thing that I've seen repeatedly used is a false dilemma argument. So essentially framing an argument by presenting an incomplete list of options while erroneously implying or even sometimes directly stating that these are the only possible options. And here I'm going to use a quote that I think many of you will be familiar with. "There is no such thing as a not racist idea, only racist ideas and anti-racist ideas." Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't racist ideas. It doesn't mean that there aren't anti-racist ideas. But to suggest that those are the only two possibilities is quite clearly a false dichotomy. It is essentially presenting a limited list of options that is not every possible option. I could present the idea that I think chocolate ice cream tastes better than strawberry ice cream. I think you have a very difficult time in proving that is either a racist or anti-racist idea. So by using this type of reasoning, it takes away from many of the arguments that are being made by these advocates. Another is the idea of affirming the consequent. And this is an argument strategy where you take a true statement, A leads to B, and then you interpret it falsely by saying, well, then if B is present, it must have been caused by A. And that doesn't account for other possible causes of A. So a very simple example. If you cut me with a knife, I will bleed. But just because I'm bleeding doesn't mean that you cut me with a knife. Now, this form of argument is often used to suggest that because systematic barriers against certain groups can lead to unequal outcomes, that is obviously a true statement. If there are systematic barriers in place, that will possibly lead to unequal outcomes. But it doesn't mean that just because there are unequal outcomes present, that alone is evidence for the presence of systematic barriers. That would be a logically flawed argument. The next issue that I've noticed in terms of argumentation is when people frame an argument in a way that makes it impossible to prove false. Essentially, this idea of an unfalsifiable argument. And here I'm going to go back into some of the sort of more pop culture references for EDI, a quote from Robin DiAngelo. White people have been socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that we either are unaware of or can never admit to ourselves. Now, if you look at that in terms of what it's actually saying, it makes it absolutely impossible to falsify that statement. Because if you deny that you have an internalized sense of superiority, the response then is, well, that's because you're unaware of it or you can't admit it to yourself. It's like the quote from Monty Python's Life of Brian, only the true Messiah would deny his divinity. And that ties into the next pitfall. And again, these are fairly closely linked. And this is the use of emotive language in or as argumentation. Now, I'm not suggesting that discussions and debates and academic arguments need to be completely free from emotion, right? Emotion is an integral part of the human existence. It's an integral part of human communication. But where emotion becomes problematic is when it has no rational relevance to the discussion, but is used instead to interfere with critical questioning or to conceal the need for critical questioning. So here again, I'm going to provide some examples of this that I think many of you will be very familiar with. The first is the argumentum ad hominem. So this is attacking the person rather than addressing their argument. And where this is essentially an emotive form of argumentation is that it often uses language intended to shame or belittle or dehumanize or otherwise devalue the individual or group, either explicitly or by implication. So I'm going to provide two examples of this that I'm sure everyone has heard before. Not agreeing with my position means that you are blank. Your opinion is not valid because you are blank. Those essentially attack the person. They do not address the argument that the person is making. The next is the argumentum ad misericordiam, so the appeal to pity, essentially language that's intended only to appeal to the human instinct to help others. An example here would be someone saying that failing me wouldn't be fair because I have a disability. Now, I want to be clear, I am not arguing that within the university institution, we shouldn't be accommodating students with disabilities, because if all it takes is a small accommodation for those students to thrive and make large contributions to the institution and to society as a whole, then absolutely we have an obligation to make sure that those disabilities receive the accommodation. But it needs to be clear that we can't take that to the extreme of using different assessment approaches for people, or essentially judging them based on different criteria. We need to make sure that this type of an argument doesn't take away from the meritocratic system that we have in place. The next is the argumentum ad consequentiam, so essentially the appeal to consequences. So this is language that's intended only to appeal to the fear of undesirable consequences. Here again, I'm going to use an example that I'm sure everyone has heard. By allowing this speaker on campus, you are putting blank at risk of blank. This is essentially an appeal to the possible consequences of what might be happening, essentially an emotional argument against why you cannot allow someone to express their views on campus. And the last one, and this is one that I wasn't quite as familiar with, but I recognized extensively and actually finally found a term to really explain it properly. This is persuasive definition. And this is essentially when someone redefines a term or introduces a new meaning to support the definer's point of view. And this is distinct from a lexical definition, in which the goal of the definition is to clarify the concept or to remove ambiguity. But the definition doesn't actually have any argumentative value on its own. So I'll give a few examples, and I'm sure that you're going to be familiar with these examples already. The first is the term safe or safety. Now, if you had asked me 10 years ago what it meant to keep people safe on campus, I would have assumed that you meant physical safety. Things like having a security service in place, things like having programs where people can get together as groups to walk across campus at night. But the term safety seems to have morphed a little bit. And I just took two definitions from the Merriam-Webster online dictionary here. The term safe, they define as being free from harm or risk, not specifying that this is physical harm or risk. But the term safe space is also found in that dictionary. And this was defined as a place, as on a college campus, intended to be free of bias, conflict, criticism, or potentially threatening actions, ideas, or conversations. So the idea here that someone is unsafe because they hear a criticism, or they hear an idea that they don't like, or they overhear a conversation that they don't like, really is an argument that changes the definition of what safety is, and it's essentially a way of trying to persuade people that we should be able to silence ideas, conversations, and criticism that we don't like. The next is the definition of white supremacy. Now, I think most of us will have grown up understanding white supremacy to be a belief system, and a belief system in which people somehow have this bizarre understanding or bizarre belief that white people are somehow superior to other races and should therefore dominate them. Why someone would believe that you can look at the value of a person based on something like their skin color is absolutely astounding to me, but that's essentially what I think most of us would have understood rather white supremacy to be. But the definition over here on the right is a much, much broader definition. And this, unfortunately, is the definition that has been adopted by the body that accredits physiotherapy programs in Canada, and one that we are required to use when we are submitting our accreditation reviews. And this is a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. Now, there are certainly ideas in there that align with the idea of white supremacy. Most of that are things that should just be abandoned completely. The problem with this definition for me is twofold. One is that it gives a much, much broader definition and much more power, frankly, to the concept of white supremacy than it really should have. The idea that white supremacy is a political system, along with something like a democracy, or an economic system, along with something like capitalism, seems like a much, much more broad definition than one would have based on a simple belief system. The idea as well is it as a cultural system, is that it sort of ignores all the breadth and depth that really comes from a well-developed or a well-evolved culture, rather, from something as simple as just the belief that skin color is something important. But the larger problem, I would say here, is the last thing that I put in red there, the idea that unconscious ideas can be emblematic of white supremacy. And that goes back to what I'd mentioned before as an unfalsifiable argument. There is no way to demonstrate what your unconscious ideas or unconscious thoughts are because they are unconscious. Now, just so that it doesn't seem like I'm picking on one side of the sort of political, I guess, spectrum, as it were, this is something that's seen across different arguments. So to make sure that I, really am not staying away from anything politically sensitive here, this is used as well when defining terms like abortion. So I think most of us would understand an abortion to be the termination of a pregnancy by removal or expulsion of an embryo or fetus. But I'm sure we've all heard people say things like abortion is murder. Now, I'm not going to try to take a stand here about the morality of abortion, but I think it is quite clear that when someone defines abortion as murder, they are doing that as a way of trying to persuade someone towards their viewpoint, not as a way of trying to clarify what an abortion actually is. All right, so that brings me to the next set of pitfalls, which sort of have some relations together. The first one that I'm going to talk about here is motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. I think that most people listening here will probably already be familiar with those terms, but I will define them just to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. Motivated reasoning is essentially the use of biased reasoning to support one's existing beliefs. So essentially coming up with arguments for why what we already believe must be right. And generally, this has to involve discounting ideas that go against those beliefs, judging them to be flawed or invalid without giving them due consideration. Along very similar lines is the idea of confirmation bias. And this is being open to believing and often actively seeking out information that supports one's existing beliefs, while tending to discount or ignore information that is not. Now, I'll be fully upfront. I know that I am guilty of this myself. If I'm looking through the literature, trying to find a reference, I will often seek out things that specifically support what I was trying to prove and sort of put aside the others and not really think about them. If I'm trying to make an argument, I will often argue for things that sort of discount others' points of view. But really what's happening when we're doing that is that both of these are essentially ways of avoiding cognitive dissonance. They are ways of avoiding that psychological discomfort that arises when we have to consider thoughts or ideas that are inconsistent or indirect with one's beliefs. But if we go back to that idea of critical theory and critical thinking, that is precisely what we should be doing. We should be considering ideas that are different from our own. We should be considering the arguments that people make against our own beliefs. And we should be giving those the credit that they are due if they are valid and reasonable arguments. So we need to make sure that despite our efforts to try to keep ourselves as comfortable as possible, that we are open to these discussions and that we are not trying to silence those discussions. So I'm going to go back to what I was talking about before with the idea that systemic barriers can lead to unequal outcomes. And I use this as an example to illustrate the idea that we can't necessarily say that because systemic barriers can lead to unequal outcomes, that just because unequal outcomes are there, there must have been systemic barriers, right? That would be a logically flawed argument. But what we need to realize is that it also doesn't mean that there aren't systemic barriers there. So if we do routinely see unequal outcomes in our institutions, we do need to consider the possibility that they may have been caused by systemic barriers. What we can't do, though, is assume that they must have been caused by systemic barriers. We need to actually develop a deep understanding of what's going on before we can make that judgment. So the next thing that I want to address is a bit of a push that I've seen of late to discourage meritocratic practices. So this would be seen in things like getting rid of standardized testing for admissions, getting rid of certain assessment practices in general. And this is potentially problematic, not only because it, sort of removes our ability to make decisions that we need to make, but there's an argument that meritocracy is actually the best way of preventing discrimination. And here I'm actually going to present the findings from a 2020 meta-analysis that looked at the impact of different diversity ideologies on inclusion. So this was a random effects meta-analysis. It looked at over 160 different individual concepts found within or ideas found within the literature across a lot of different areas of study. And it looked at 4 specific diversity ideologies and their impacts on 3 different measures of inclusion. Now, the terms here are probably going to be familiar to everyone, but they may not be universally defined. So I'm going to read them out just to make sure that we're all speaking the same language and we can understand the results of the study. So the 4 diversity ideologies included assimilation, in which non-dominant groups would have to adopt the practices of the dominant group; colorblindness, in which group differences are essentially just minimized by ignoring them; meritocracy, where all demographic groups are treated equitably, i.e. the rewards that they receive are balanced with the contributions that they provide; and multiculturalism, where people are encouraged to learn about, support, and/or value group differences. The measures of inclusion that they looked at were negative stereotyping, the belief that outgroups have negative traits; prejudice, so a negative affect towards outgroups; and discrimination, the negative treatment of outgroups. And what this meta-analysis found, somewhat not surprisingly, is that multiculturalism, so learning about other groups, had the strongest negative correlation with negative stereotyping and prejudice. So essentially, by learning about other groups, we were less likely to have negative beliefs and negative affect toward those other groups. But the strongest effect size found for all of the study comparisons was that meritocracy had a negative association with discrimination. In other words, if we want to prevent negative treatment of different groups, we need to make sure that our system is based on a meritocratic principle. Okay, so here I am going to pivot a little bit and address some other issues that are in a little bit different area. The first is the idea of negative attribution bias. Now, negative attribution bias can be defined as the interpretation of neutral or ambiguous information as being negative, or perceiving negative subtext or intentions when none were actually intended. This has really come to the forefront with the idea of microaggressions, the idea that things that people say that aren't explicitly discriminatory are actually intended to be discriminatory or prejudiced. The difficulty here is that there's actually some fairly strong evidence that asking people to focus on these negative subtexts, to actually interpret ambiguous information in negative light, is actually harmful to people's psychological well-being. And that's particularly important given the increase in mental health issues that are being seen on campus these days. If we want to encourage good psychological well-being among our students, we need to make sure that we are not encouraging to constantly focus on negative issues, to constantly focus on negative subtext. There may even be some indirect implications for physical health because of the increases in things like related stress. If we wanted to contrast that, we could look at the benefits of nuanced thinking, of cultivating generosity of spirit, of giving others the benefit of the doubt, and of encouraging people to recognize and correct their negative thoughts. Those are essentially the principles behind cognitive behavioral therapy, and that has very substantial evidence in terms of improving psychological well-being. So along with EDI, if we want to ensure that we are creating an environment in which we are supporting the psychological well-being of our students on campus, discouraging negative attribution bias, discouraging this idea of constantly looking for microaggressions, of constantly looking for ways that people are potentially wronging us, we really need to discourage that. Along those same lines is the idea of zero-sum thinking. Now, zero-sum thinking essentially is when we believe that one person's group or one person or one group's gain must come at the expense of another person or another group's loss. So what this essentially does is it creates intergroup dynamics that are viewed as competitive. It creates group divisions, and those group divisions become a primary point of focus. So it essentially causes partisan divides in terms of the ways that people think. And what this can lead to is essentially mistaken assumptions about what would motivate an opinion different from one's own. And it actually promotes counter-empathy for outgroups. So essentially this idea of focusing on the negative, I think we really need to make sure that we're discouraging, and we need to make sure that we are encouraging people to give others the benefit of the doubt. We need to make sure that we are encouraging the idea that, even though somebody might say something that we don't necessarily agree with, or we think that maybe they could have worded it better, we don't immediately start making negative assumptions about that person. The next set of pitfalls that I want to address begins with the idea of minimizing the importance of fundamental rights and freedoms. And this one, I think, really is primarily seen in the push against freedom of speech. So in the US, we know that the Second Amendment has this protection for freedom of speech. In Canada, we actually have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees 4 fundamental freedoms: the freedom of conscience and religion, the freedom of peaceful assembly, the freedom of association, and then the one that's in the middle there that I've highlighted in red, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. Now, the most common argument against freedom of expression is that by allowing certain ideas to be voiced, by allowing certain ideas to be put forward, we are potentially causing harm to others, or we are potentially oppressing others. That, if you'll remember, is the argumentum ad consequentium. It is essentially the appeal to consequences. It is a logically flawed form of argumentation, suggesting that one thing will cause some undesirable consequence. The other thing that can potentially come up, though, is just sort of arguing that fundamental freedoms aren't necessary, right? That they really aren't that important. But I think what's really essential here is that we recognize why these fundamental freedoms were put in place in the first place. And that is because they are, at their core, anti-oppressive. They are intended to ensure that dissenting voices cannot be silenced by those with power. Without that freedom of expression, it becomes easy for people with power, regardless of how that power is derived, whether it's from being in government or simply being part of a mob. It allows people with power to silence voices that they disagree with, to silence dissent. And it is essentially that dissent that is necessary to allow us to continue to evolve and advance as a society. Now, one of the other things that has been brought up, though, is that there are certain jurisdictions in which people also are guaranteed the right rather to protection of dignity. But it's important here to weigh the importance of freedom of expression versus the protection of dignity. Very recently, 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada had a ruling that essentially did just that. It weighed the relevance and the importance of freedom of expression versus people's right to the protection of dignity. And what that ruling said was that the safeguard of dignity does not confer a right not to be offended, and that the safeguard of dignity does not confer protection from emotional harm. So if we want to weigh freedom of expression versus the protection of dignity, that analysis must be focused on the likely discriminatory effects of the expression, the actual way that the person is treated, not on the emotional harm suffered by the person alleging the discrimination. And this ties in a little bit with the idea of social justice, and something that I have seen quite frequently where people are advocating for what they describe as social justice, but which sounds to me a lot more like vengeance or revenge. So here I'm going to provide one quote and one sort of paraphrased idea to really help to illustrate this. On the left here, we have a quote, again, from Ibram Kendi. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Now let's contrast that with this idea from Friedrich Hegel. Revenge is a new injury. It becomes an infinite process, with the insult being inherited without end from generation to generation. Based on that idea, the call for continued discrimination as a way to fight past discrimination essentially comes out as revenge. It becomes an insult that is inherited without end from generation to generation. I think this quote from a Sherman and Strang article is very, very useful. The primary task of justice is to manage emotions. The primary emotion for justice to manage is the desire for revenge. And that then brings me to the last thing that I want to address, and that is the occasional failure that occurs to recognize or acknowledge past progress. And this is particularly easy when you're young, right? You haven't experienced all of this past progress. All you see are the things that you consider to be injustices in front of you. But it's important to recognize and acknowledge that we have made huge strides over the last decades and even centuries in terms of creating a more egalitarian, a more fair society. And I'm going to leave you with a quote because I don't think I could say it better than this. The hatred that men bear to privilege increases in proportion as privileges become fewer and less considerable, so that democratic passions would seem to burn most fiercely just when they have least fuel. That was said almost 200 years ago. I think that it is even more true today than it was then. So I'd like to thank you for listening. I think I'm under my time, which is good. And if people have questions, I am very happy to hear them.
So we have a few questions. So I will go in order. Thank you very much for your presentation. So our first question is, can you provide some evidence that faculty are using different standards of assessment for people living with disability, or that faculty don't fail people living with disability? What source are you using to substantiate this? I'm concerned that this may be speculative fiction, so that person is worried that it's a fictional scenario, but that isn't based in reality.
So I can tell you from direct experience that I don't believe that's actually happening at McGill specifically. At McGill, we do have very specific rules in terms of once a grade has been entered, it can't be reversed, etc. I am, however, aware, and again, I will say this is secondhand information. I haven't gone and actually looked at the evaluation standards at other universities, but I have been told by a student that they have had a mark actually erased from their transcript in the past based on a disability, based on a health issue. I have been told at one of the local CEGEPs, essentially, that a student can't be failed based on their standing in terms of their association with the term. It's the whatever program actually provides accommodations for students with disabilities at that institution. There are different names at different universities. So the example that I gave there wasn't necessarily an example to suggest that this has actually happened. I gave this as an argument that could be made as an appeal to pity, this idea that it wouldn't be fair to fail me because I have a disability. I'm not suggesting that this is actually happening. I don't have concrete evidence. I don't have research evidence to suggest that schools are actually not failing students based on things like disabilities. I have heard secondhand information. This may be occurring, but I don't actually have definitive proof that it is. So I wasn't intending to imply that this was widespread. I wasn't intending to suggest that we don't need to be making accommodations for students with disabilities, but there does seem to be some push for and some degree of traction being gained in terms of arguing that maybe we need to be evaluating different people based on different standards, whether it's for a disability or other reasons. It really doesn't matter.
Perfect. So we have another question from Giselle. Are meritocratic practices not based on inequitable access to education? So she gives an example, the ability to engage with medical exam entrance. So for example, the medical exam entrance, MC80, MCAT exam. Yeah, so the significant monetary cost associated with preparatory courses, the time to prepare for those, access to parental guidance and mentors, amongst other barrier. How is that not a systematic barrier?
So the difficulty there, of course, is that you can make a reasonable argument that, at least in theory, that there may be systematic barriers that are in place before someone ever reaches the point of being able to take that admissions exam, that standardized test, that would disadvantage them. The difficulty with that is providing concrete evidence that that is actually the cause of the reason that they performed poorly on the test or that they weren't able to prepare for the test. And here I will admit that in terms of the activity that I've had or the involvement that I've had with our admissions processes in PT, it is very difficult to determine exactly what someone's merit is. What we do know is that when we look at things like just marks from school, whether it's from high school, whether it's from CEGEP in Quebec, whether it's from university, that is, based on statistical analyses, the most reliable marker we have of the capacity for future performance. Where things get very difficult, though, is that often when we're looking at students who are applying to very competitive programs, we may get hundreds of applicants where the differences in the marks are tiny. So considering that someone has, for example, using the 4-point GPA scale at McGill, somebody with a 3.9 GPA is somehow less merit, has less merit than somebody with a 3.95 GPA, where we don't know, whether the person with the 3.9 GPA has also been working full-time on the side, has also been caring for a loved one, maybe they have children that they have to care for example, whereas the person with the 3.95 has been doing nothing but study for the last 4 years. There are definitely things that need to be looked at outside purely those standardized testing approaches, simply looking at marks. What I'm suggesting essentially, though, is that we can't completely abandon them. And the reason that we can't completely abandon them is we don't actually have anything that has been demonstrated to be reliable that we can then rely on. And essentially, what we'd be doing is going purely to subjective assessment, purely to our own beliefs and our own ideologies in terms of deciding what we should be using for admission, and abandoning really the only thing that we have that does have any sort of statistical merit to support it as a valid and reliable assessment tool. And what we want to make sure that we don't end up doing is admitting students into programs and essentially setting them up to fail, right? If someone hasn't been able to achieve a level of academic success up to that point, the chances that they will suddenly be able to achieve academic success when they get into medical school, where the stakes are that much higher, where the pressure is that much higher, and where the material becomes dramatically more difficult, frankly, we are potentially putting people at risk for failure just by allowing them into a program that they're not actually prepared for. So I understand that we don't necessarily have all of the answers available to us, but we can't essentially be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. We need to make sure that we do hold on to the things that we do know have some degree of proven reliability, but that we also consider other factors and make sure that we do allow for the possibility that there are other things that could be influencing that. As I said, even if we don't have evidence of systematic barriers that are purely proven, we still have to account for the possibility that those barriers might be there.
Perfect. So another question, your definition of equity, while I don't disagree, that's the speaking, while I don't disagree that bias-free distribution of resources is important, I find does not account for things like a reconciliation. For community like indigenous communities who have historically been denied land, intergenerational wealth, and have had those resources reallocated to settlers' population, does your definition fail to account for the needs to reconcile those unfair resource allocations? So this, I guess, says it brings the idea of a reserved seat in university program. Does that not go against your definition of equity?
So the first thing I want to point out again is that I mentioned several different approaches to distributive justice or distributive fairness. It's not that I'm suggesting that equity is the only approach that can be used. I think that it is probably the approach that makes the most sense in general when it comes to things like admissions into programs, but there are always other factors that need to be taken into account. So if we look at things like the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, the findings of that committee in Canada, that is something that definitely needs to be taken into account. We now have this, whether it's considered a fully legal binding document or not, I don't know, but we essentially now have this other governmental commitment that we need to now make up for past wrongs, which are clearly, clearly things that have occurred. There's no denying these things have occurred. There's no denying that they were wrong. And there's no denying that that has disadvantaged a certain segment of the Canadian population. So we need to find ways to make up for that. And I think that those are some of the things, maybe sort of relating back to a previous question, when we're looking at things like admissions into programs, those are things that need to be taken into account. Maybe what we need to have are separate streams of admission for people coming from groups that clearly have a historical basis for being disadvantaged. What we also need to make sure that we're not doing at the same time, though, is changing the standards associated with that. So, for example, if we wanted to have a separate stream of admissions for Indigenous applicants to Canadian programs, we still need to keep the same sort of threshold admissions criteria that we know are indicative of the ability of those students to succeed in the programs they're being admitted to, because there's no point admitting someone into a program that they're not ready for. So maybe it means that they compete in a different pool of applicants. but that those pools start out in terms of the same basic criteria for what we'd look at for our thresholds for admission. And then once we've established those thresholds of admission, once we've established that now we are only looking at applicants who have demonstrated the capacity to succeed in these programs, that we can then essentially create other criteria for admission that are potentially a little bit more subjective, but keeping in mind as well that we don't have any criteria that are purely prescriptive and that have the level of evidence to support them that means that we can't be using anything else. So I'm not suggesting that we can't be looking at things like reconciliation. I think that we have very good reasons for doing so when it comes to things like healthcare and education. But at the same time, we can't be completely abandoning all of the other systems that have been put in place that essentially are going to help to make sure that the people who are being admitted into programs are the ones that are likely to succeed in those programs.
So we have a question. I think so. So we have a question from Christine. She'd like to further study the idea that paying attention to microaggression is harmful. So she's asking if you had provided a source during your presentation, and if not, what are you basing that idea on?
So let me just quickly find that source. I do have an article that I referred to there. So the article was Daniel Watanabe in 2020. I can provide the references that I used here. I have come across some other articles, and this reference I don't actually have at the tip of my tongue, looking at things like trigger warnings, this idea that we should be using trigger warnings to make sure that people are, can remove themselves from the situation so they don't hear things that might potentially be psychologically harmful to them. And some of the research that's coming out on that suggests that just hearing the trigger warning is just as harmful psychologically as actually being exposed to the thing that they are warning the student about. So I do have at least one article. I can probably provide some others if somebody really wants. But there certainly is a growing body of literature out there to suggest that particularly this focus on the negative may potentially be psychologically harmful. The reference that I made to the possible indirect implications for physical health actually came from an article that looked at levels of racial discrimination and sort of racial conflict essentially in certain areas in the United States, which essentially showed that whether it was white people who had negative beliefs about Black people or Black people who had negative beliefs about white people in that area, the people who had those negative beliefs also tended to have worse physical health. Now, of course, that's a correlation, not a causation, but it could be reasonable to suggest that if these are having an impact on psychological well-being, that could also potentially be related to things like stress, and stress does have some very clear associations with physical health problems, specifically the cardiac issues that were being referenced in that study. So it's a growing body of literature to suggest that this is potentially an issue. What I will say, though, is that the evidence behind cognitive behavioral therapy, where one of the main ideas there is the idea of recognizing and correcting negative thoughts, which includes things like negative attribution bias. Cognitive behavioral therapy has a huge amount of research supporting its ability to improve psychological well-being. It's not a miracle cure. It doesn't take care of all mental health issues, but it certainly is beneficial. So you can sort of look at that from a bit of a reverse causation standpoint, that if we have a treatment that addresses something and causes improvement, then it's possible the thing that it was addressing was one of the sources of the problem. Again, not a pure causative relationship, but certainly one worth giving some credence to.
So one of our guests is asking that you stated that focusing on the negative creates a negative atmosphere that worsens EDI. What happens when a student, for example, comes to us saying that they are experiencing racism? If your answer is we have to give the benefits of the doubt, does that not invalidate that person's claim? What if it is indeed racism? Who gets to decide if it is racist? And we had two questions in that regard about focusing on the negative and giving people the benefits of the doubt.
Okay, so the first thing here, again, we're getting into some areas where, it's not quite as simple as black, white. Really what I was intending to focus on were situations in which people were making inferences that weren't actually based on explicit statements. So looking at subtext, looking at ambiguous information as being negative. There are quite clearly racist statements that can be made. I mean, if I make a negative statement about somebody simply because of their skin color, that is quite clearly a negative statement. That is quite clearly something that needs to be addressed, because that type of behavior really doesn't belong in the university environment either. If we're going to be looking at valuing diversity, if we're going to be valuing inclusion, then having people subjected to explicit attacks based on things like immutable characteristics, that is obviously not something we want to encourage in our program. So I do want to be clear that I'm definitely in favor of the idea of diversity and inclusion, and we need to be being sure that we are creating an environment in which people feel comfortable. Where I have a problem, though, is when people are implying that someone meant something that was different from what they actually said, or suggesting that the way that something was phrased was intended as derogatory, when it may be that just the person saying it had no idea that that language could potentially be harmful to someone. So the idea of potentially giving someone the benefit of the doubt when something ambiguous, or when there's some subtext in something that someone perceives as being there, I think there it's important to make sure that we're not immediately jumping to negative conclusions. Maybe a good way of putting this would be if we look at sort of the difference between a single incident and harassment, right? If someone says something once, it's pointed out to them. They apologize for it and say, that's not how I meant it. I apologize if that's how it was understood. I'll do my best not to say that type of a thing again. That's great. I think that there we've solved the issue. But if someone has something pointed out to them as being, something that someone doesn't, that potentially finds offensive and persists in doing it, or makes a point of doing it in front of that person, then even if it's not explicitly something that's racist, even if it's not explicitly something that's discriminatory, then we start getting into the area of harassment, right? And that's something that is definitely protected against, at least at McGill. I believe most universities have a policy against harassment and discrimination. So if something explicitly racist is said, I will not defend that at all. I mean, that's something that needs to be called out and it needs to be addressed. If something is implicitly interpreted as racist, that's when we need to start looking at the nuances. And I think that's where people should feel comfortable, hopefully, of pointing that out, either to the person who said it or to someone else who will point it out to the person who said it. And as long as that person will then make an effort to correct that and not do that kind of thing again, I think that's perfectly fine. So it's not necessarily that I don't think that microaggressions are potentially harmful. It's not necessarily that I think that people can't interpret things in subtext, and particularly if you've been hearing something over and over and over again, and then you hear it from one more person, even if that one more person hadn't intended it, it doesn't discount the psychological impact that it has. The issue is encouraging that. The issue is encouraging people to look for it. And that's where potentially I think we may be doing more harm than good.
So that one is a bit harder to enter. So it would say that you're doing what you've explained in your presentation, that you're putting freedom of expression against protection of dignity.
Right.
That is a zero-sum game. So I don't know how clear that question is, but
okay, so I think what was being pointed out there is that if we're looking at weighing one right against another right, the suggestion is that that's a zero-sum game. I think that I would suggest that freedom of expression benefits everyone. If we start trying to restrict freedom of expression, then that potentially means that what we want to say then gets restricted as well. The expression that the weapons that you use will be used against you, I think is a very good way of putting that. That if we start putting in place, or if, let's say, the current government starts putting in place measures to restrict speech around certain areas, and then 4 years later, another government comes in place with different ideological basis, and they start putting in place restrictions on freedom of speech against other things that they don't like to hear. Eventually, we start restricting everyone's freedom of speech. there clearly do need to be restrictions on things like freedom of expression. The example of yelling fire in a crowded theater, I think that's a very good example. And what I was essentially pointing out here is, and again, based on that Supreme Court of Canada ruling, it's not that we have to say that freedom of expression always wins against protection of dignity. What we have to do is look not at the emotional harm that someone is suffered from hearing it, but looking at the discriminatory effects. So if I say something, and then that actually leads to different opportunities for the person that I have said it about, that then had actual discriminatory effects for that person, and that should be remedied. But if all I did was hurt someone's feelings, I'm not suggesting that feelings aren't important. I'm not suggesting that emotional harm isn't important. But we can't be restricting freedom of speech simply based on the potential for causing emotional harm, because those fundamental freedoms, as I said, were put in place specifically to be anti-oppressive. They were put in place so that people with power cannot silence dissenting voices. And sometimes, unfortunately, that means that we're going to hear things that we don't like.
So here we have one of our guests that says that you seem to argue for the supremacy of quantitative research, that unless something is proven on a large scale, it is either untrue or perhaps unimportant. So where does this leave place a space for dissenting voices in research that cannot be demonstrated at large scales, the outliers? But are people realities nonetheless? Does ignoring their reality move away from the truth? So I think he's speaking about how, going to the example that you were giving before, that what the use the language of person of color would experience, that another person would not perhaps feel the same way. So how do you take account for that if it's not large scale, or perhaps even if it's not something that can be perhaps proven through the scientific method?
Okay, so one of the difficulties here, of course, is all of the requirement effort that is required to go from what would be considered a belief to what would be considered a knowledge or fact. What I would suggest here is that if we were to look at something as simple as whether the Earth revolves around the sun or the sun revolves around the Earth, for the very, very long time, the overarching belief, at least in Western societies, was that the sun revolved around the Earth. That was what people believed, right? It didn't make the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun any less true. So just because we hadn't arrived at that understanding yet, because we hadn't arrived at that knowledge, didn't mean that it wasn't true. So just because we don't have evidence for something doesn't mean that it's not true. But it means that we also can't just assume that something is true because we believe it. So what we really need to do, at least if we have a certain theory that we want to put forward, a certain hypothesis that we want to put forward, we have to make sure that we are willing to test that hypothesis. So we can't simply be putting forward theories, claiming those theories to be true, and then enacting regulations and rules based on those theories without ever questioning the validity of the theory, without ever questioning without ever formulating hypotheses that would allow us to then test those theories. Any good theory started out as just that, a theory. And as you started to increasingly develop more evidence to support it, as you started to get more hypothesis testing occurring, as you started to increase the amount of observation that essentially aligned with that theory then starts creeping closer and closer towards being accepted truth. A good example would be the theory of evolution, right? We cannot necessarily say for sure that we know evolution to be a fact, but there is such an overwhelming amount of evidence to support that evolution has occurred that right now it has essentially become the scientific consensus for what we will teach. On the flip side of that, we could look at creationism, right? A lot of people believe that people were created exactly as they are right now. There is much less evidence for that. It doesn't change the idea that certain people believe that, but it does mean that if we were to look at this from a purely rational standpoint, and if we were to compare the idea of creationism versus evolution, we have to give more credence to evolution because there's a substantially larger amount of evidence to support it. One of the issues that can come up here as well is that there are certain things that aren't actually sort of fundamental truths about the world, right? A lot of things that we do in terms of our interactions as human beings in our society, these are things that we have created as human beings, right? So they're not things that we can ever prove to be true. The meaning of a word is a good one, right? A word means what everyone agrees it means. We can't say that it's not true that a word means something, because essentially words are all made up, right? We've made them up. And as long as enough people agree that a word means a certain thing, then it means that thing. So this is not the kind of thing that we can look at in terms of determining knowledge of facts or knowledge of truth, right? There's a limited number of things in which that idea of knowledge of facts and knowledge of truth comes in, which then again plays into what I was talking about before with the whole idea of persuasive definition. I can't say that because someone has created a persuasive definition or defined a term in a way that was intended to persuade people, that isn't a valid definition of a word. If enough people believe that that's what the word means, that's what it means. I'm simply arguing that we shouldn't be trying to do that as a way of changing definitions for words, because what it's actually doing is confusing our ability to communicate clearly. If some people believe that a word means one thing and other people believe that a word means another thing, we've now lost our ability to communicate clearly. I probably went off on a bit of a tangent.
So we have a Spencer that is congratulating you for your speech, for your session. And then do you feel that DEI in any way can play a beneficial role in university and beyond? I think you've talked about that during your session.
Yes, yes, I do. Yeah, and I think this is kind of where that idea of viewpoint diversity comes in. If you'd asked me that when I was 18, I would have said no, because I really hadn't had that much experience of the world, right? As I've sort of grown and had more exposure to different cultures, to different, different religions, as I've met different students within the programs that I've been teaching in, it's become quite clear to me that my experience of the world is just that. It's my experience of the world. So if someone comes to me with a very different experience and can demonstrate that, certain things have occurred that have really disadvantaged them compared to the advantages that I've had, then it makes sense that we should be looking at that, right? Because that person may have had the capacity and the potential to contribute a huge amount to society, maybe well beyond what I've contributed, but was held back because of things that were completely beyond their control. I hope these sirens in the background aren't really disturbing. So I do believe that EDI has a role to play. I think that what I'm seeing in terms of the EDI efforts that are happening at university in various different organizations that I'm involved with, I'm seeing a bit of a swing of the pendulum away from the purely activist approach to EDI, where people are coming in with very firm beliefs and just saying that we need to impose these beliefs on everyone. Everyone needs to accept this way of doing things. And it's coming back to a slightly more nuanced approach where we're willing to look at multiple viewpoints, accept that there are multiple ways of seeing things, and realizing that, yes, as long as we have the resources available to us to accommodate for some of those things that are potentially have disadvantaged people based on whatever aspect of the diversity spectrum it may have been affecting, those are things that we can reasonably do. We also, though, need to take into account the fact that we do have limited resources, that we do have limited capacity to do this work, and there needs to be a certain focus on sort of big picture elements. We can't necessarily accommodate everything. So, within Canada, I think it's perfectly reasonable to focus on things like the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, past treatment of Indigenous peoples. That is a national shame. I think that it's something that we really need to work towards addressing, but we need to make sure that we're not doing it just based on theories that have been thrown out, and now we're going to do everything we can to address that theory. We actually need to make sure that we're doing it the right way. And sometimes that means consultations with Indigenous peoples, but sometimes when you ask someone what's necessary, it doesn't actually correspond with what they actually truly believe. So you look at, in research, you can look at the idea of survey research where you're asking someone versus observational research where you're watching their behaviors. And sometimes what they say they want versus what they actually show they want based on their behavior is not the same thing. Which doesn't mean, of course, that we shouldn't be consulting with people, but it does mean that we don't necessarily want to simply just give everyone what they're asking for without considering the sort of secondary and tertiary consequences that those things will potentially put in place.
Yeah, so that would be one of my questions. So when you're talking about allocating resources, I think one of the issue is if we are starting from anecdotal evidence or emotion, there's an assumption of the issue that I'm encountering, like the behavior of the person is rooted in unconscious bias or things like that, when it might be something completely different. It might be time management, because some patient with certain situation might take longer, but she's on a schedule, and that might be one of the things that comes into play. And so my question would be, when allocating resources, even more so with EDI training, which actually costs money because we are sending professional. So there's a real necessity for a time assessment, but it kind of goes against that sense of urgency that a lot of activists, I would say, feel. And they feel like taking time is a way to, let's say, not address the issue or to stay in the old ways of doing. So how would you respond to the activists that feel that sense of urgency, but at the same time might lead us to spend a large amount of resources and not fix the problem?
So in my experience, this kind of goes back to another form of justice that would be procedural justice. And I didn't get into that, but that same article I was referring to that had all the information about distributive justice also had similar information about procedural justice. And one of the things that I have found is that when people approach me with a point of view that something needs to be done, usually they're quite happy to understand that as long as work is being done to address it, whether it's going to provide a result immediately or whether we can explain clearly that we are taking our time because we need to make sure that we do this right the first time, most people will be quite satisfied with that explanation. And the aspect there of procedural justice that really needs to be viewed is the idea of transparency. So within university programs, for example, or within the university as a whole, there is a certain necessity for what we are doing to be transparent, for us to be clear and visible in terms of the actions that we are taking. I'll give as an example the committee that I actually chair in our program around EDI. This was formed in 2021, in part because students in our program asked us to start doing more related to EDI. And they actually wrote us an open letter sort of more or less demanding that we start taking all of these actions. And when I read the letter, I said, this is fantastic. We're already doing 90% of the things that are in this letter. But the students didn't know that we were already doing that stuff. So the failure that we had was that we hadn't been transparent in all of the things that we were doing. We hadn't been clear that we were already aware of these problems, that we were already trying to take care of these problems. Again, it comes down to resources. Being transparent takes time. Writing reports and explaining to people what you're doing does take time, which then potentially takes away from the time you have to dedicate to the effort itself. But there is a necessity to be transparent in terms of the actions that are being taken. And I find that generally the vast majority of people that I have dealt with when it comes to issues of EDI have been very, very reasonable. As long as they understand that efforts are being taken, they won't necessarily expect results now. They realize that to do things properly, it does take time.
So we have a question from Christine. She's asking that some people would argue and think, and she thinks there's something to that what we call meritocracy historically has not actually ever been merit-based, ignoring historical oppression and the generational carry through it. So how do we know that meritocracy would work if we ever actually try to apply it, I guess?
So I'll start by saying there's definitely some validity to that argument, right? We can argue all we want about having a meritocratic system, but it's just not as simple as that, right? It's the same way we could argue that our economic system is a capitalist system, right? There are differences in how capitalism can be applied. There are differences in terms of the rules that are applied in terms of what you can't and can't do, right? So while we have, I think, largely a meritocratic system, and the efforts that have been put in place, particularly over the last few decades, really have really been aimed at creating as meritocratic a system as possible, I'm not suggesting that we have a perfect system in place. I'm not suggesting that we've ever had a pure meritocratic system. What I'm arguing for is that as long as we continue to make steps towards a better system based on merit, then what we're actually creating is a more equitable environment. And some of that may actually mean taking into account things like access to education earlier in life. But there's again limited things that we can do at the university level, right? We can have somebody who, you know, had all kinds of potential as a child, but didn't get the educational background that they needed. We can't bring that person into the university environment because they don't have the background necessary to succeed in the university environment, and we don't have the resources to support them to get to that point. So while there are definitely things that we can do at the level of the university, there are other things that need to be done at the wider societal level. And that's, I think, where I would go back to that last quote that I put up. That idea that when people see privilege in society, it becomes more glaring when there are fewer privileges to be seen. So, you know, 300 years ago, the idea that everyone should be able to go to university was just not, it was not on. There was no way that people would think that they even had the possibility of going to university. I would suggest that in today's society, most children born in Canada at least have the possibility of going to university because there are things in place to support them along the way. Public education, public health care, various different safety nets in place to make sure that they're not disadvantaged as badly as they would be if they didn't have those safety nets. But it doesn't mean that everybody is starting from the same place. I will freely admit that, you know, I've had a life that, if I look back on it, has a huge amount of privilege in it. And if I had encountered more obstacles along the path, I probably wouldn't be where I am right now. So I'm not suggesting that I've gotten everything that I have based on merit alone, but I also don't want to discount the fact that I did work hard in school, that I did study, that I did apply myself. I had jobs. So, you know, there have been certain efforts in place, but it certainly isn't a level playing field in Canada yet. I think that many of the things that have happened in the last 50, 60 years or so have definitely worked towards creating a more level playing field, but the job isn't done yet. We certainly don't have a meritocratic society yet, but that doesn't mean, again, as I said, that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. The evidence still suggests that meritocracy is the best way of preventing discrimination. So what we need to do now is work towards meritocracy, not suggest that we already have it.
So it's an ideal to
exactly
aim for at. So I think that's a good place to stop. There's many more questions that we haven't been able to address. So for people, you can email at info@colloquia.ca. And with your question, just specify which speaker or the title of the talk. And so if we can, we'll transmit those questions to you. No promises, but never know. So thank you very much. And so we'll carry on.
Thank you. And thank you for listening.